my American Studies 140 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins again. This is basically the week 2 lecture summary, or for those who are taking the summer version of this course, the second half of week 1. This week, or this particular lecture, is about this history and culture of DC as it evolves through the first 2/3 of the 19th century. I left off pretty much with George Washington and a band of surveyors roaming around the countryside and the farmland and the small towns that would become, or would become part of was known as the district in the 1790s. But within that story, there are a whole bunch of other stories, right? There's a story of Benjamin Banneker, a freed black man who in the 1790s worked for George Washington as a surveyor. He was a mathematician, a surveyor, and apparently a very good clockmaker who could make freestanding wooden clocks. And so people like him, dozens of people like him, and George Washington surveyed the area, put down foundation stones at all 4 corners of what was to be the original Washington, D.C. If you've ever seen the movie National Treasure with toupee-wearing Nicolas Cage and some of the other actors in that movie, John Voight, etc., you find that they use this sort of the founding stones explanation for finding hidden treasures in and around the United States in D.C. and New York, Black Hills of South Dakota, etc., etc. Completely ahistorical, based on some fringe belief that because people like Banneker and George Washington were Freemasons, that they were holding all kinds of vast secrets to protect the country, kind of thing. It's kind of ridiculous. But anyway, I digress. So they basically found, the truth is, the area around here, topographically speaking, is basically a marshland, fairly marginal farmland, somewhat okay to farm on farmland, or used up farmland that had been used up from about 150 years worth of tobacco growing, as tobacco was the cash crop from Maryland and Virginia colonies and for most of the 17th century and for all of the 18th century. And that points to the fact that this area that we now call the DMV was once area that had plantations, and with plantations and a plantation economy came chattel slavery, the ownership of folks from generation to generation based on the ownership of the wombs of women, in this case African women. So the enslaved here are enslaved African women we're talking about, and men. Since slavery was tied to the woman, meaning that if you were born of a woman that was already enslaved, you too were a slave from the time you were born. It wasn't based on a man, because there was a possibility that a man could get freedom through skilled trades, through escaping, through other means. So that's why chattel slavery was based on the wombs of black women. And so that's part of the culture of D.C. too. It's the culture of the United States, so it has to be part of the culture of the nation's capital. And at the same time that slavery is part and parcel of this area, note the fact that we're not talking about Native Americans here. We're not talking about the Anacostia. We're not talking about the Patumki. We're not talking about the Piscataway and these other groups that occupy the area around the Chesapeake Bay region between southern New Jersey and southeastern Pennsylvania, the Delaware River Valley system, Maryland, Virginia, southern Maryland, Tidewater, Virginia, and that whole area, this whole region, including what is now the nation's capital, was a region that was occupied by those tribes and other Native American groups who gradually had been driven out by Englishmen and English women as they settled and colonized the area primarily for the purposes of plantation-based slavery. That doesn't mean people don't own small farms and maybe didn't own any slaves. Doesn't mean that every enslaved African didn't stayed slave the whole time. In point of fact, this system evolves. It takes basically the better part of 2 generations between the 1620s and the 1660s for slavery to fully evolve into the form that I described a few minutes ago. So until it's codified in law, that slavery is basically bound in the wombs of black women. So two things are happening simultaneously. Englishmen and women are basically wiping out Native American groups through a combination of warfare, encroaching on their territories and warfare, and primarily through disease, because they bring with them Eurasian diseases, Eurasian/African diseases, I really should say. Smallpox, measles, mumps, rubella, bubonic plague, all of those diseases that we get shots for, presumably if we're not anti-vax, are the types of things that wiped out much of the population, even more so than warfare. So that by the time you reach the period of time that George Washington's on horseback surveying this marshy, swampy, somewhat marginal, somewhat useful, used to be useful but is no longer useful after 150 years of continuous plantation-based farming land, this territory, right? So, when you hear the phrase drain the swamp, it's based on the knowledge that this area used to be a lot of marshland, very swampy. And of course, over the first 150 years of DC's history, a lot of efforts are dedicated by engineers to drain the marshland around here, to drain the swamp, to drain the area near the Potomac River and the Anacostia River so that you could build buildings, fill it in with rubble and so on so that you could build monuments and have parkland and be able to to fish down at the wharf, or and keep things from flooding. They built a canal in Georgetown, the Baltimore and Ohio Canal that runs through Georgetown part of DC in the 1820s and 30s just for that purpose, for bringing shipping into DC and also control flooding of the Potomac along that part of what is now the District of Columbia/Virginia/Maryland. So there's that. Just figured I'd throw that in there. So that's what we're talking about in terms of the origins of DC. DC is part of 2 different slave states. DC is a place where Native Americans have been driven out. DC is a place where there's a potential for promise, but the land itself is fairly marginal. So let's fast forward a little bit. So the story of DC breaks down into building the two biggest projects that DC would have, pretty much for its first 100 years. One being the White House, which was originally built by the end of 1800. John Adams occupies it for a few months before he's voted out of office and Thomas Jefferson takes over. And the U.S. Capitol, which is built by 1810, and Congress finally holds its first votes, first sessions there in 1810, 1811. Well, both of those buildings were burned down within a few years of that because of the War of 1812, which the U.S. started in response to the British kidnapping its merchant seamen for several years during the Napoleonic Wars. We invaded Canada and failed to take Canada as part of making it part of the United States because of our imperialistic tendencies. We wanted Canada to be part of the United States early on in the early national period. The British responded in 1814 by actually invading. And in the process of invading, they defeat American troops in the Battle of Bladensburg, which, by the way, is just 15 miles up the road from D.C. The British marched into D.C. at the end of August, set fire to the Capitol, set fire to the White House, set fire to a bunch of other buildings. But then the hurricane comes up the coast and puts the fire out that very evening, scattering the British troops as well, so that the bones from the Capitol, the bones for the White House are preserved, and they're eventually rebuilt. Now, the thing you also have to understand, which is part and parcel of DC history and culture with that, is that Both versions of the White House, the original version of the White House and the one that's rebuilt after the War of 1812, and the version of the Capitol that was originally built by 1810 and rebuilt by 1826, were built primarily with slave labor. It was a combination of slave labor, skilled labor, unskilled labor, indentured servant labor that built both buildings, but it primarily was the labor of enslaved Africans, of enslaved black folk who built um, both buildings. So, and you have articles. You have at least one article that covers that, and you have a recording for this week that covers that as well. So, there are also other stories about DC and its evolution. There's a story of Pierre Lafont and his plan to have the DC look like this grand imperial city on the order of Versailles, which never really takes off because Congress refuses to provide funds to build but so much, right? Especially early on. The country doesn't have a lot of money. There's a story of James Smithson, this mysterious British tinkerer and inventor and entrepreneur who he bequeathed to the District of Columbia, to the federal government, $500,000 to build a building that would basically house scientific and technological innovations so that people could see, so the public could see. $500,000 or 500,000 pounds roughly in 1835, when this money was left toward them, is the equivalent of about $600 million today. So that's a lot of money. And so first Smithsonian building, the Castle building, that's built by 1855. There's a story of the Washington Monument, which is finally supposed to be a monument to George Washington, which was started in 1846, but abandoned in terms of building in 1854, 1855, and didn't get restarted until the 1870s. That's why you have two different kinds of stone, in terms of coloring for the building. Why is all of that? Because there really are two stories, for the history of Washington, D.C. that covers the period roughly between its founding and the first buildings and up to the Civil War. One is the story of essentially white Washington, the story of folks who, generally speaking, are not investing in building what we consider the grandness of the nation's capital, the monuments, the federal buildings, the historic sites, the museums, and so on and so forth. That money is mostly private money. It's unbeknownst to most people. Most of what we see in Washington that is the touristy type of Washington is built with private funds. So federal government sometimes matches those funds. Sometimes the federal government passes acts where they'll say, we'll give a certain amount of money if you can raise a certain amount of money. But for the most part, the federal government is not interested in building more than what they already have. The Capitol building on Capitol Hill and the White House. And maybe a few other buildings here or there so that judges can meet and decide law, so that legislatures can meet over lunch and those kinds of things. But generally speaking, they don't have long-term plans there. So it takes private funds to build a lot of this stuff. And while there is an elite class of folks who live in the federal district at this point, some in Georgetown, some in Washington City, some in Washington County, as it were, some on swampland. The truth is that they're not getting together as one to say, hey, let's build out the city. So the city is a very haphazard-looking city for much of the 19th century. Some roads are paved. Pennsylvania Avenue's paved. Cobblestones along what would be the downtown district between roughly 6th Street and 13th Street Northwest, right? Some paved roads along Capitol, but there are also a lot of dirt roads. There are also a lot of small alleys in that Washington City area as well. Dirt, mud tracks. So that's your DC for much of the 19th century, a gritty, dirty looking city, just like any other city of the 19th century, really. So that's one story. The other story is actually the story of North versus South, of slaveholding states versus states that benefit from slavery indirectly because slavery supplies the raw materials for the Industrial Revolution up north, provides the basis for venture capitalism that leads to the building of railroads, that leads to um, the expansion of textile industries, that leads to expansion in international shipping, because otherwise the South is the South's growing of cotton, and cotton's the cash crop of the 19th century, is not just for the U.S. market, but for the U.K. market, because the U.K. has an empire for the international market in general. So that fuels the American economy. And it's this dependence on slavery that is at the heart of the issue between Northerners and Southerners. That the whole country is dependent on slavery, really, but the South was way more dependent than any other group. So they were doing everything they can to preserve it. And with the abolitionist movement, with the movement toward trying to end slavery, D.C. becomes a prominent part of it. The retrocession of the Virginia part of D.C. that happens in 1846 is part of a long process. There are several reasons why. Congress retrocedes the southern part of the District of Columbia that was once part of it, parts of parts of Fairfax County, Arlington County, Virginia, and the city of Alexandria, is for two reasons. One, they're not building any buildings over there. The first thing I pointed out about the lack of investment in D.C., particularly among the white elite. Second reason, of course, is because there was rumors that Congress would and the city would eventually outlaw slave trading in D.C., meaning slave auctions. And so they wanted to preserve slave auctions for themselves. So if the federal district got rid of slave auctions, that would mean you couldn't have slave auctions in Alexandria, in Arlington County, in Fairfax County. So that's the other reason for the retrocession. So Virginia gets back those Northern Virginia counties and the city of Alexandria in 1846, which explains why the shape of D.C. is the jagged shape that it is at the southern bottom now. So there's your answer. Retrocession, 1846. All of that puts D.C. in the crosshairs once the Civil War period rolls around during the 1850s, the march toward the Civil War, and when the actual Civil War starts in 1861. D.C. becomes this place where it has to literally ring itself with forts. Some 68 forts are built, 68, 70, somewhere in that neighborhood, are built all around D.C., ringing D.C. with cannons and guns to protect it from potential invasion from what becomes known as a Confederacy, or Confederate States of America. 11 states secede from the Union between 1860 and 1861 after Abraham Lincoln is elected President of the United States, because they fear that with him as president, with this new Republican Party as the one in control, that they would outlaw slavery. So they seceded from the Union. The story of states' rights is a post-Civil War story that Southerners have been, and other folks have been telling people around this country pretty much since the end of the Civil War in 1865. But the truth is, states' rights for what? To own slaves. That's what this war was all about. It wasn't just states' rights in general. Who cares about tariffs? Tariffs are only important if you have slaves to grow cotton and send overseas in the first place, right? It's about slavery. So anyway, so D.C. becomes this place, heavily armed place, swells in population because of Union troops coming into the city. Some estimates put between that and all of these escaped former slaves, runaway enslaved Africans coming to D.C. to populate the area, swells the population to anywhere between 250,000 and half a million people at the height of the Civil War. And so D.C. is no longer this small, sleepy village or a small town of 10, 12, even maybe 40,000 people. reaches 75,000 by 1860, but explodes to 132,000 by 1870. The black population, which had been about 14,000, including 3,000 slaves by 1860, grows to about 43,000 by 1870. And that's a major shift in population. And the Civil War really points out the need for D.C. to really become a city at this point. So I'll stop there.